Hey guys, so tonight we're diving into something that most history books skip over with embarrassed silence: the Roman public latrine. Yeah, you heard that right. Not the grand colosseums, not the aqueducts soaring across the countryside, not the mighty legions marching toward conquest. We're talking about where Romans went to take care of business. And trust me, it's way more complicated, way more social, and way more interesting than you'd ever expect. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were marvels of engineering, centers of community, and absolutely packed with secrets. So before we get started, if you find this as weirdly fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the weird, uncomfortable, and utterly human side of history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see who's out there learning about ancient toilet culture at 3 in the morning. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's venture into the shared quiet of a Roman latrine together. When you picture ancient Rome, you probably imagine marble temples, toga-wearing senators debating in the forum, perhaps a gladiator or two for good measure. What you probably don't imagine is thousands of Romans sitting shoulder to shoulder on a long bench riddled with holes, doing what humans do every single day. But that's exactly what was happening in the public latrines of Rome. These weren't shameful, hidden places. They were civic institutions. They were community gathering spots. They were, in many ways, the beating heart of daily Roman life. The Romans understood something that many modern societies seem to have forgotten. Sanitation is civilization. They took it seriously, really seriously. Seriously enough to build elaborate public toilet systems in nearly every major city. Seriously enough to make sure even the poorest citizens had access to clean facilities. Seriously enough that using the latrine became a routine social activity, something you did with your neighbors, your friends, sometimes even your enemies. The scale of it all was staggering. In Rome itself, there were over 140 public latrines scattered throughout the city. Some served a few hundred people. Others accommodated thousands. They weren't run as government services exactly, though they were occasionally subsidized or built at public expense. Often they were maintained by entrepreneurs who charged a small fee, usually just 1 quadrans, a tiny bronze coin. For that price, a Roman could get access to clean facilities and the kind of social experience that was absolutely central to Roman life. Because here's the thing about Roman public latrines that modern society has completely missed. They weren't isolated, shameful spaces. They were social clubs disguised as bathrooms. The engineering of a Roman latrine was nothing short of brilliant. When you walked into one, you were entering a structure that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about sanitation, water management, and civic design. Most latrines were built partially below street level, which allowed gravity to do the heavy lifting when it came to moving waste away from the city. Water flowed beneath the latrine through channels, essentially flushing the entire system automatically. Fresh water came in, waste went out, and the whole thing worked with a kind of elegant simplicity that makes modern engineering look needlessly complicated. The typical Roman latrine had a long bench, sometimes carved from marble if it was a fancy one, more often from stone or even wood in the less affluent areas. The bench was honeycombed with holes, sometimes dozens of them in a single row, arranged close enough that users would sit hip to hip. There was no privacy in the modern sense, no stalls, no dividers. Just you and whoever else needed to go at that particular moment, sitting right there together, having what was probably the most honest conversation of your day. The entire structure was designed for water flow. Channels ran beneath the benches, carrying waste away toward a main sewer that would eventually deposit everything in the river, or, in some cases, into underground tanks, where it could be collected for use in tanning leather or other industrial processes. Nothing was wasted in Rome. Your waste was literally someone else's treasure. Above the benches, the ceiling was usually vaulted or arched, which allowed for better air circulation and prevented the buildup of toxic gases. Walls were often smooth stone or marble, chosen because they could be cleaned and resisted moisture damage. Floors were tiled or paved to allow for easy sweeping and water drainage. Some of the more elaborate latrines even had heating systems piped through the walls to keep things comfortable in winter. These places were genuinely sophisticated. They weren't accidents of engineering. They were the result of generations of Romans figuring out the absolute best way to handle human waste at scale. And they worked. For centuries, they worked. But the engineering wasn't what made Roman latrines truly special. It was the social experience of using them. The latrine was democratic in a way that almost nothing else in Roman society was. A wealthy merchant sat next to a slave. A senator occupied the same bench as a day laborer. An old widow and a young soldier did their business mere inches apart. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, the latrine was one of the few places where class distinctions had to be temporarily abandoned. You couldn't pull rank when you were in that position. You couldn't assert dominance. You were just a human being taking care of a universal human need. This created a strange sort of equality that probably didn't exist anywhere else in ancient Rome. And because you were all sitting there together, you talked, you gossiped, you shared secrets, you exchanged news, rumors, jokes, and observations. The latrine became the ancient equivalent of a social network, though with the added benefit of actually being in person. People would linger, not because they needed to, but because the latrine was where you found out what was happening in the city. Did the baker's daughter get engaged? You'd hear it at the latrine. Was someone cheating on their spouse? The latrine knew first. Had a soldier returned from distant provinces with tales of strange lands? He'd tell the latrine. In many ways, the latrine was the internet of Rome. It was where information flowed, where gossip spread, where the real news that mattered to regular people got discussed and disseminated. The formal channels of communication, the written notices, the official announcements, they were all secondary to what people learned sitting on those stone benches. The physical comfort of using a Roman latrine was probably somewhere between pleasant and unpleasant, depending on circumstances. The stone was cold, especially in winter, which meant settling yourself onto a latrine seat was never exactly comfortable. But once you were seated, if you were in one of the better latrines, it wasn't terrible. Some facilities had backrests, some had armrests. A few of the most luxurious ones had heated seats in winter. The benches themselves were often polished smooth from centuries of use, which sounds unsettling, but was actually better than you might think. Rough stone would have been genuinely painful. The smooth stone was almost gentle in the way that stone can be. What made the experience unpleasant was primarily the sensory assault. The smell was honestly probably the worst part, despite the water flowing beneath the benches. Even with good ventilation and constant water movement, you're talking about the waste of hundreds or thousands of people accumulated in one place. It was probably worse on hot days, when the smell would have been absolutely overwhelming. Worse on crowded days when the water flow couldn't keep up with the volume. In winter, the smell was probably less intense, but the cold was brutal. Imagine sitting on a stone bench in January with multiple other people, trying to conduct your business while your teeth chatter and everyone around you looks equally miserable. The sounds would have been interesting too. Not just the obvious sounds, but the echoes. A vaulted ceiling amplifies everything. The whole latrine would have been alive with noise. Splashing water, the rude sounds that inevitably accompany the process, whispered conversations, someone laughing at a joke, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of clothing. It would have been loud. Not aggressively loud, but definitely not private. Privacy, as it turned out, was basically non-existent. What's remarkable is that Romans didn't find this lack of privacy shameful. They valued the social aspect of it. They preferred using public latrines to having private facilities at home, which wealthy Romans did have. Why would someone with a private toilet choose the public latrine? Because the latrine was where you went to be part of the community. It was where you maintained your social connections. It was where you stayed informed. It was where you were seen as a participating member of society. Using the public latrine was, in a sense, a civic duty. It was how you kept your finger on the pulse of the city. This speaks to something fundamental about Roman culture that we often miss. They weren't uncomfortable with bodily functions the way modern Western societies are. They didn't view the latrine as a shameful place where you did something dirty and then left as quickly as possible. They viewed it as a normal part of life, something to be managed with humor and pragmatism, and something that could be socially productive if approached correctly. There's a famous inscription in a Pompeii latrine that translates to, "I came here, I relieved myself, I left." Simple, direct, no shame, just factual description of what happened. And yet the fact that someone bothered to write it down suggests that the experience was normal enough, mundane enough, that it could be joked about in public. You could acknowledge what you were doing without embarrassment. The health benefits of having public latrines can't be overstated, especially when you consider what the alternative was in cities without them. An outbreak of cholera or dysentery could devastate a population that lacked decent sanitation. Rome had a huge population, concentrated in a relatively small area. Without the infrastructure of the latrines and the aqueducts that supplied the water, Rome would have been hit regularly by devastating epidemics. Instead, Rome had centuries of relative stability and health, in part because they'd invested in making sure their sewage was managed properly. It's one of those things that history books don't spend much time on, but it's arguably one of Rome's greatest achievements. They didn't cure disease through medicine. They prevented it through infrastructure. They took human waste, which is undeniably a health hazard if not handled properly, and they built a system that kept it away from the living areas of the city. They moved it away, they treated it, they sometimes even recycled it. The Roman approach to sanitation was pragmatic, effective, and honestly kind of admirable from a modern perspective. Disease prevention wasn't something they fully understood in scientific terms, but they understood it intuitively. They understood that if waste accumulated, people got sick. If water flowed properly and waste was moved away, people stayed healthy. That basic intuitive understanding led to a whole infrastructure that protected one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The types of people you'd encounter at a latrine varied wildly depending on which one you went to. The big public latrines near the forums or near the baths were usually crowded with a mix of everyone. Rich, poor, everyone in between. But there were smaller neighborhood latrines that served specific districts. There were latrines near the brothels, which probably had a specific kind of clientele. There were latrines near the military barracks that served primarily soldiers. There were latrines near the docks that served sailors and merchants. Each one had its own character, its own social dynamics, its own reputation. Some latrines became known as places where you'd encounter a certain type of person or hear certain kinds of news. If you wanted to know what was happening in the political world, you went to one latrine. If you wanted business gossip, you went to another. If you wanted news from the provinces, the docks latrines were your best bet. The latrine was a sorting mechanism. It helped people navigate and understand the city around them. And because of this sorting function, it also became a place where social bonds were reinforced. You'd see the same people every day. You'd sit on the same bench. You'd participate in the same kinds of conversations. Over time, a kind of community would form. People would reserve certain spots if they were regulars. There would be favorite times to go when you knew certain friends would be there. The latrine became a place of genuine belonging in a way that's hard to explain to modern sensibilities, but which seems to have been genuinely important to Romans. Class distinctions did exist in the latrine, but they manifested differently than in other parts of the city. You couldn't buy special treatment while you were actually sitting on the bench. Everyone was equally vulnerable, equally human, equally performing the same basic function. But before and after, class mattered. Wealthy Romans might arrive at the latrine in a litter carried by slaves. They might have a personal attendant who would clean them afterward. They might use the fancier latrines in the better parts of town. They might use their own private facilities at home, despite the social cost of doing so. Slaves had their own separate latrines in some facilities, or they went at specific times when they wouldn't encounter free Romans. Women and men sometimes used different latrines, or went at different times, though this varied by city and by era. Soldiers had their own latrines. Merchants had their own. But the principle was consistent. Once you were there, once you were on the bench, the system treated you the same. Water flowed for everyone equally. The smell was the same for everyone. The cold was the same for everyone. This must have created an interesting psychological dynamic, a moment where the social hierarchy that governed every other aspect of your life was temporarily irrelevant, a moment where you were just human. And then you'd get up off the bench, rejoin your social position, and go back out into the world. But you'd carry that memory with you. For a few minutes every day, you'd been treated as an equal. You'd sat next to people from completely different worlds. You'd had conversations you might not have had anywhere else. The sounds of a Roman latrine would have been quite distinctive. The constant flow of water underneath created a background noise, almost like a stream or a waterfall, depending on how many people were using it. This actually served a practical purpose. It covered up the more obviously unpleasant sounds that inevitably accompanied the facility's use. It was privacy of a sort, acoustic privacy. If you couldn't see what someone was doing, the sound of the water at least made it less obvious what was happening. And people added to the soundscape, the splash of water as people rinsed themselves, the scrape of the strigil, a curved tool Romans used to scrape off oil and dirt after bathing, though sometimes used in latrines too. The murmur of conversation, laughter, sometimes arguments, though probably not too violently confrontational given the vulnerability of the position. A Roman latrine would have had a particular acoustic signature, a particular set of sounds that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who spent time there. And those sounds would have been associated with community, with being part of the social fabric of the city. People who used the latrine regularly would have been soothed by those sounds, the way modern people are soothed by familiar background noise, that gentle roar of water, the subtle hubbub of people, the occasional voice cutting through to ask a question or share a piece of gossip. It was, in its own way, comforting. The business side of running a latrine was actually fairly sophisticated. Someone had to maintain the plumbing. Someone had to clean the benches. Someone had to manage the flow of water. Someone had to collect the money. Someone had to handle the sludge that accumulated in the tanks. This created a whole economy around the latrine. People were employed specifically to keep them functioning. The person who ran the latrine, the forake, was often an entrepreneur who paid for the right to collect fees. They'd use their profits to pay workers, to maintain the facilities, and to make a living for themselves. It was legitimate business, respectable business. Managing public sanitation was seen as a necessary and valuable service. Some of these latrine managers did quite well for themselves, especially if they managed one of the big central latrines in a major city. They were providing an essential service that everyone needed. They were contributing to the health and functioning of the city. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important work, and Romans understood that. There's something almost admirable about that straightforward pragmatism. You need sanitation. Someone has to manage it. That person deserves to be paid. Let's figure out the business model and move forward. No shame, no embarrassment, just logistics. Maintenance of the latrines was a constant job. The water had to flow. If it stopped flowing, the smell would become unbearable and disease could become rampant. The benches had to be cleaned. Tourists who visited Rome in the 18th and 19th centuries, after the latrines had been abandoned and sealed for over 1,000 years, were shocked by how clean they were when they were excavated and opened up. The stone was scrubbed smooth. The channels were clear. It suggested that maintenance had been seriously attended to. People took pride in their work, or at the very least they understood that it was necessary work that had to be done properly. The strigils, those curved tools used for cleaning, were sometimes left behind or stored in latrines. There's evidence suggesting that some latrine attendants would provide cleaning services in addition to access to the facilities. For a small fee, they'd clean you off with fresh water and a strigil. This was particularly valuable after a trip to the bathhouse or after a day of physical labor. The latrine attendant was a real job, a profession, someone who had specific knowledge and skills related to maintaining the space and keeping users satisfied. They were people who were essential to the functioning of the city, who contributed to public health and community life. What Romans wrote on the walls of latrines tells us a remarkable amount about what was on their minds. There's been graffiti in Roman latrines preserved in places like Pompeii and other sites. Some of it is crude. Some of it is clever. Some of it is political. Some of it is romantic. Some of it is just someone marking that they were there, leaving evidence that they existed, that they mattered, that they passed through this space. Apollonius was here, carved into the stone. Felix loves Felicia, scratched into the marble. Political insults about candidates, jokes and puns, advertisements for brothels or businesses. Someone's name accompanied by "is a bastard." Someone else's name with "is great." The walls of the latrines were like a bulletin board, a message board, a space where anyone could express themselves without consequences. You could say things in a latrine that you might not say in the forum. You could criticize people, make jokes, express desires, assert your existence, all in a space that had a particular kind of immunity from the usual social rules. The latrine was where real opinions sometimes got expressed. Not always, and not everyone, but enough that it created a space for a kind of honest communication that was harder to find elsewhere. Those scratched inscriptions are like voices calling across 2,000 years, telling us what people cared about, what they loved, what they found funny, what they found important enough to write down in the most mundane and private space they inhabited. There's an interesting tension in the Roman latrine between its function as a place of necessity and its function as a place of social bonding. These two functions don't obviously go together, but Romans somehow made them work in tandem. You came because you had to, because your body was telling you to go. But once you were there, you found yourself in a social situation. You were surrounded by other people. You were part of a community. You were engaged in something that everyone did, that nobody could claim was somehow above or below them. This created a kind of equality that modern societies have largely lost. We're deeply private about bodily functions now. We hide our bathrooms away. We feel embarrassed about needing to use the toilet. We certainly wouldn't want to discuss it with others or do it in public. We've built a whole cultural edifice around pretending that these functions don't happen or don't matter. Romans took the opposite approach. They acknowledged the need. They built infrastructure for it. They made it a social activity. They found ways to make it functional and comfortable and even pleasant. And in doing that, they created something that modern societies could probably benefit from. If not the literal shared toilet bench, then at least the attitude that taking care of human needs is something to be managed pragmatically rather than hidden shamefully. What Romans understood intuitively was that everyone eats, everyone sleeps, everyone goes to the bathroom. These are universal human experiences. There's no shame in acknowledging them or dealing with them openly. By the late Roman Empire, the latrine culture was beginning to shift. Sanitation became less of a public priority. The aqueducts that fed the latrines started to be neglected. The careful systems that had kept them functioning began to fall apart. As Rome's political and economic power declined, so did the infrastructure that supported public life, including the latrines. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, most of the public latrines had ceased functioning. The water stopped flowing. The sewage systems became clogged. People stopped using them. What had been a defining feature of Roman urban life for over 400 years simply vanished. Without the political will to maintain them, without the economic resources to keep them functioning, they became unusable. And interestingly, they weren't replaced. For over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, European cities didn't have public toilet systems. The knowledge was lost. The infrastructure was forgotten. People went back to using chamber pots and outhouses and throwing waste into the streets. It wasn't until the 19th century, over 1,000 years later, that cities started rebuilding the kind of sanitation infrastructure that Rome had pioneered. We actually took a massive step backward in our civilization for over 1,000 years in this regard. The medieval world, for all its achievements, didn't have the latrine culture of Rome. And it paid a health price for that loss of knowledge. Diseases that the Romans had managed to control through sanitation knowledge reappeared and devastated medieval cities. In the end, the Roman latrine tells us something profound about civilization and human ingenuity. It shows us that Romans understood something that we sometimes forget, that taking care of human needs is not shameful or trivial. It's fundamental. It's worthy of careful engineering and substantial investment. It's something to be proud of, because a society that can manage the basic functions of human life well is a society that can function well overall. The Roman latrine wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of achievement that made it into the history books. But it was real. It was important. It worked. It served millions of people across centuries, and it created, in its own way, a space for human connection and community that modern society has largely abandoned. When we think about Rome, we think about the Colosseum and the Forum and the great temples. But maybe we should also think about the latrine, about the thousands of people sitting together on stone benches, taking care of business, sharing secrets, being part of something larger than themselves. Because that's where a lot of real Roman life happened. That's where the real community was formed. That's where people were most honest with each other. And that's a story worth remembering. The latrine reminds us that civilization is built not just on grand monuments and military conquests, but on the mundane infrastructure that keeps people healthy and connected. It reminds us that the most important achievements are often the ones we take for granted, the ones we don't talk about, the ones we're embarrassed to mention. But they matter. They matter deeply. And that's the secret the Roman latrine has been sharing with us for 2,000 years, waiting patiently for someone to finally listen.